On the night of August 16th, 1951, a baker named Léon Armunier was delivering bread through the narrow cobblestone streets of Pont-Saint-Esprit when the world came apart. The flames started first, shooting up from the ground beneath his bicycle wheels, orange and blue and impossibly bright, even though the street was cold and dark and nothing was burning. He stopped. He looked down at his hands on the handlebars. They were melting. The skin was running like wax, pooling at his wrists, sliding between his fingers. He could feel it happening. He opened his mouth, and the scream that came out did not sound like his own voice. It sounded like something being torn. By the time his neighbors reached him, he was on the ground, rolling, clawing at his own chest, convinced that serpents had gotten inside him and were eating him from the inside out. He was 32 years old. He was sober. He had never touched a drug in his life. And across town, in dozens of other homes, on other streets, behind other closed doors, the same thing was beginning to happen to 500 other people who had no idea why. How does an entire town go insane in a single night? How do 500 people simultaneously lose their minds, see the same demons, hear the same voices, jump from the same windows, and die in the same darkness, without any of them understanding what is happening to them? That is the question that has haunted Pont-Saint-Esprit for over 70 years. The French government said it was an accident, a fungus in the flour, a tragedy with no villain. But the documents that emerged decades later told a completely different story. They pointed not to a bakery and not to nature. They pointed to a government building in Virginia, to a program that was already experimenting on American citizens at home, and to the terrifying possibility that what happened in Pont-Saint-Esprit was not an accident at all. It was a rehearsal. This is the story of the town that went mad overnight, and the evidence that the people who made it happen were never held responsible for a single death. To understand Pont-Saint-Esprit, you have to understand the world it existed in. It is August 1951. The Second World War ended 6 years ago, but the peace it brought is an illusion. The Soviet Union has tested its first atomic bomb. China has fallen to communism. Korea is at war. And inside the intelligence agencies of the United States, a quiet panic is spreading. The Cold War is being fought, not just with weapons, but with information, psychology, and fear. American strategists are looking for an edge. Not a bomb, not a missile, something subtler, something that could destabilize a population without a single shot being fired, something that could reach inside the human mind and take it apart from the inside. Inside the CIA, a program called Project Artichoke is already underway, testing hypnosis and drugs and psychological pressure on prisoners and defectors. A new program is being conceived that will eventually be named MKUltra. The men running these programs are asking questions that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Can you drive a person insane with a chemical? Can you do it without them knowing? Can you do it to an entire city? They are not asking these questions theoretically. They are looking for a place to find out. Pont-Saint-Esprit is a small market town of about 4,000 people in the Gard department of southern France, nestled along the western bank of the Rhone River. It has a medieval bridge that dates to the 13th century. It has a church in the center of town that has stood for 600 years. It has a weekly market where farmers bring wine and cheese and vegetables from the surrounding countryside. It is the kind of place where the baker knows every family by name, and the bread has been made the same way for generations. It is quiet. It is trusting. It is, in the language of military planners, a soft target. On the morning of August 15, 1951, residents of Pont-Saint-Esprit began purchasing bread, as they did every day, from the bakery of Rochebriand on the Rue du Mage. It was ordinary bread. It looked right. It smelled right. It tasted right. Families brought it home and ate it with their evening meal. By nightfall, on August 16th, the first patients were arriving at the local hospital, run by Dr. Gabay. A woman came in, vomiting and shaking, unable to explain what she was seeing. Then, a man who'd been found running through the streets naked, screaming about invisible animals attacking him. Then, a child who could not be woken from a sleep that was not sleep. Then, another, and another. Dr. Gabay had been practicing medicine for 20 years. He had never seen anything like what was walking through his doors that night. The symptoms defied every diagnosis he knew. Patients had extreme nausea and vomiting, but that was almost incidental, almost a footnote to what was happening to their minds. The hallucinations were the thing, vivid, specific, terrifyingly real to the people experiencing them. A farmer named Charles Grevier insisted for 3 days that his body had turned to copper and that he was slowly oxidizing. He could feel himself rusting. A woman named Toinette Bouquet told nurses that the room was full of tigers and screamed continuously for 6 hours. A man named René Yaltel tried to drown himself in the Rhône because he was convinced that fire was the only thing inside his body and that water was the only way to put it out. He was pulled from the river by 2 fishermen who had no idea what was wrong with him. By the end of the second day, 300 people had been hospitalized. The local facility was overwhelmed. Patients were being moved to hospitals in Avignon and Montélimar. 7 people would die before it was over. Dozens would suffer lasting psychological damage. An entire town was in a state of collective psychosis, and nobody could explain why. The investigation that followed moved quickly toward a single explanation. Ergot, a fungus called Claviceps purpurea that grows on rye grain under certain climatic conditions and produces alkaloids that can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and a condition called ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire, which had devastated European populations in the Middle Ages. French authorities concluded that the flour used by Rochebriand had been contaminated with ergot, and that this contamination had caused the outbreak. Case closed. The baker was briefly investigated, and then cleared. The flour supplier was examined. A report was filed. The official story was printed in the newspapers, and the town was told to move on. But the doctors who had treated the patients were not satisfied. Dr. Gabay and his colleagues published a paper in a French medical journal noting that the symptoms they had observed did not match classical ergotism in several important ways. The hallucinations were too vivid and too uniform. Classical ergot poisoning produced convulsions and a burning sensation in the limbs, a condition caused by the vasoconstriction of blood vessels. It did not typically produce the kind of elaborate, immersive, visually specific hallucinations that the people of Pont-Saint-Esprit were describing. The uniformity was also strange. Ergot produces different effects in different people depending on dosage and individual physiology. But in Pont-Saint-Esprit, case after case described the same categories of experience: fire, animals, transformation of the body, the sensation of being invaded from the inside. It was as if they had all read from the same script. And there was one more problem. Several people who had not eaten bread from Brienne's bakery also became ill. If the contamination was in the flour, how were people being affected who had not consumed the contaminated bread? The French authorities had no answer. The ergot explanation was filed, and the case was officially closed. It would remain closed for almost 60 years.
Hank Albarelli was not looking for Pont-Saint-Esprit when he found it. He was a journalist and investigative researcher who had spent years trying to unravel the death of Frank Olson, the CIA scientist who fell from the window of the Statler Hotel in New York in November 1953, the same man whose story opened our previous video on this channel. Albarelli had obtained thousands of pages of declassified CIA documents through Freedom of Information Act requests and was working through them methodically, looking for anything connected to Olson. What he found instead, buried in the middle of an unrelated document dated 1954, was a reference to a town in France. The document was a memo from a CIA operative to a colleague. It discussed various field operations involving psychochemical agents, and in one paragraph, almost in passing, it referred to the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident and stated clearly that the cause had not been ergot. It stated that the episode had been produced by diethylamide, the active psychoactive component of LSD, which had been introduced into the local bread supply covertly as part of an operation conducted by CIA assets working in coordination with the United States Army Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Fort Detrick was the U.S. government's primary biological and chemical weapons research facility. It was the same facility that Frank Olson had worked at. It was the same facility that was at the center of MKUltra. The document was not the only one. Albarelli found a second memo in which a CIA officer described the Pont-Saint-Esprit operation in a communication to a scientist at Sandoz Laboratories, the Swiss pharmaceutical company that had first synthesized LSD in 1943 and that had been supplying the substance to American intelligence for research purposes. The Sandoz scientist's name in the document was not fully legible, but the content of the memo was clear. The operation had been a field test. The goal had been to determine whether LSD could be introduced into a civilian food supply covertly and at sufficient concentration to produce mass psychological incapacitation. The town of Pont-Saint-Esprit had been the testing ground, and it had worked. What the documents described, if they are authentic, is a crime of extraordinary scale and coldness. CIA operatives or their assets had traveled to a small town in an allied country. They had gained access to the local bread supply, possibly through the mill that supplied the bakery, possibly through the bakery itself, possibly through some other point in the supply chain. They had introduced LSD into the bread at a dosage calculated to affect a large number of people simultaneously, and then they had left. They had driven or flown back to wherever they came from and filed their reports and moved on to the next project. 7 people died in Pont-Saint-Esprit. The CIA documents do not mention them by name. They are referred to only in aggregate as part of the data produced by the field test. The children who could not be calmed, the old men who fell into comas, the young woman who was held down by 4 nurses while she screamed about the tigers. They are data points. They are evidence that the substance worked as intended. In the language of the people who ordered this operation, they are a successful outcome. The operation was overseen, according to Albarelli's research, by figures connected to the same network that would later run MKUltra. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist who directed MKUltra from 1953, was connected to Fort Detrick and to the Sandoz supply chain. The timing is precise. Pont-Saint-Esprit was August 1951. MKUltra was formally authorized in April 1953. The 2 years between them were a period of intense experimentation, of field tests and feasibility studies, of the CIA asking whether its theories about psychochemical weapons could be made real. Pont-Saint-Esprit may have been one of the answers to that question. The survivors of Pont-Saint-Esprit did not know any of this for decades. They had been given the ergot explanation and told to move on, and most of them had tried. But the experience had not left them. A woman named Marie-Odile Bistagne was 11 years old when the outbreak happened. 60 years later, she told a journalist that she still remembered her father being taken to the psychiatric hospital in Montélimar and not coming home for 3 weeks. She remembered visiting him through a window because children were not allowed inside. She remembered that when he finally came home, he was different, quieter, slower, as if something had been taken from him that was never fully returned. She said the town did not talk about what had happened. There was shame attached to it, she said, as if going mad was a moral failure rather than something that had been done to you, as if the people of Pont-Saint-Esprit had somehow brought it on themselves. Nobody told them they might have been poisoned on purpose. Nobody told them that men in suits had possibly driven into their town, contaminated their food, and driven away again. The shame they felt belonged to the people who had ordered the operation. The people of Pont-Saint-Esprit were owed an apology that never came. When Albarelli published his findings in his book, A Terrible Mistake, in 2009, the reaction in France was immediate and intense. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Survivors and their descendants demanded that the French government reopen the investigation. The mayor of Pont-Saint-Esprit wrote a formal letter to the French Ministry of Justice requesting a new inquiry. A documentary was made, a memorial was proposed, and the CIA and the United States government said nothing. The French government conducted a brief review and concluded that there was insufficient evidence to warrant a formal reopening of the case. The CIA declined all requests for comment. Albarelli died in 2019 at the age of 71, still waiting for an official response. He had spent over a decade on the case. He had interviewed surviving CIA operatives, former Fort Detrick scientists, French police officers who had worked the original investigation, and survivors of the outbreak. He was certain of what he had found. He never received confirmation or denial from any official source. The documents he had discovered remained in the CIA archives, available to anyone with enough patience and enough Freedom of Information Act requests to find them. They remain there today. On August 16, 1951, a baker named Léon Armunier saw flames shooting from the cobblestones of Pont-Saint-Esprit. and screamed at his own melting hands. We started here, and now we know, or at least we have reason to believe, what those flames were made of. Not fire, not fungus, a molecule, synthesized in a Swiss laboratory, carried across an ocean, slipped into bread that families had been buying from the same bakery for 30 years. The people of Pont-Saint-Esprit were not casualties of nature. If the documents are real, they were test subjects. They were data. They were chosen because they were small and quiet and trusting, and because nobody expected anyone to look too closely at what happened to them. 7 of them died. Hundreds more were changed in ways they never fully understood. And the men who ordered it, if there were such men, returned to their offices and wrote their reports and went home to their families and were never charged with anything. Léon Armunier died in 2009, the same year Albarelli's book was published. He was 89 years old. He had spent 58 years knowing that something had been done to him on that August night. He had accepted the ergot explanation because there was no other explanation available to him. He never knew about the documents. He never knew about Fort Detrick. He never knew about the memo that referred to his town as a field test. He died not knowing, and that perhaps is the darkest part of this entire story. Not the experiment, not the deaths, but the fact that the people who survived it never got to know the truth, and the people responsible never had to tell it. This is dark remedy. The truth is always darker than the official story, and we are just getting started. If this story shook you the way it shook us, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to be heard. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. We post every single week, and the next story is already darker than this one. And in the comments, tell us what you think really happened in Pont-Saint-Esprit. Was it ergot? Was it the CIA? Or was it something we still do not know? See you in the next one.